The sun was just beginning to slice across the Masai Mara Reserve in Kenya at 5:15 a.m. Warden Annex Weed, a man who had spent 2 decades protecting this wild expanse, saw something that made the coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. Sitting motionless just 10 feet from the low front porch of this outpost cabin was a colossal lioness, and held gently in her massive jaws was a tiny, motionless cub. This was a violation of every unwritten rule of the wild, a creature of her power deliberately approaching a human dwelling. She approached not with aggression, but with the posture of absolute desperate surrender. Her eyes, those golden windows into a prehistoric soul, were fixed entirely on him, transmitting a silent message that shattered every survival instinct he possessed. Slowly, with an unbearable weight of caution, she lowered her head, placing the limp body of the infant onto the dusty wooden step, taking one deliberate step back, her chest heaving as she waited for the unbelievable thing she was requesting of a complete stranger. Alex's training screamed at him. Never interfere, never trust the big cats. This is a trap. But the small cub's body, barely rising and falling with the thinnest thread of life, was soaked along its flank from what looked like a deep, infected wound, likely inflicted by a territorial rival or an unseen snare. His hand, guided by a force stronger than fear, turned the deadbolt. The slow, agonized creak of the door swinging inward seemed loud enough to wake the entire savannah, and the lioness instantly coiled, every muscle tensing into a weapon, a low, guttural warning rumbling deep in her throat. He descended the steps one by one, his heart hammering against his ribs like a panicked drum. He knew this was the moment of decision, the single point where fate balanced on his sheer willingness to trust her trust. He knelt, scooping the chillingly small body into his jacket, and as he rose, his gaze locked with hers. There was no rage, only a profound, exhausted faith. He retreated back into the cabin, pulling the door shut on the most dangerous act of his entire career, transforming his humble quarters into a makeshift veterinary clinic. The injury was catastrophic, deeper and more contaminated than he could have imagined. As he sterilized the wound, the cub let out a thin, sharp, agonizing shriek that cut through the early morning quiet. Outside, the world exploded. The mother's roar was a terrifying sound of nature betrayed, a sound of wood-tearing panic as she clawed and slammed her body against the cabin door. Alex's hands shook violently, sweat stinging his eyes, but he could not stop. He was halfway through suturing the lacerated flesh when the tiny chest under his palm suddenly went still. All breathing ceased. Panic surged and he pressed his fingers rhythmically against the little heart, begging, praying for a sign. Then a gasp, a weak, miraculous rise of the ribcage. He quickly injected the antibiotics, wrapped the survivor in warm blankets, and sat vigil through the night, his hand resting on that precious, fragile life, never once closing his eyes as the mother's shadow stayed fixed against the glass. The next morning, the cub had fought through the worst, but the damage required professional intervention. A clinic 50 kilometers away was the only chance for proper surgery. Carefully, Alex loaded the bandaged creature into a small crate, placed it in the back of his aging Land Cruiser, and started the engine. He braced himself for the inevitable explosion of protective fury from the mother, who had already tensed into a hunting crouch. But as the truck began to move, slow and deliberate, the lioness made her next impossible choice. 2 kilometers down the road, he checked the rearview mirror and his blood ran cold. She was there running, a relentless golden-brown spectre, keeping an exact steady distance, chasing the vehicle. 10 kilometers passed, then 20, then a full 50 kilometers of grueling, dust-kicking pursuit. She never once broke pace, never dropped back, running with a desperate, lung-bursting endurance that defied physics, fueled by nothing but the desperate, unshakable faith she had placed in him back on his porch. When he pulled into the veterinary center parking lot, the staff were not looking at him, but past him, where the lioness simply sat down on the hot asphalt, quietly waiting. The surgery performed by Dr. Eleanor Vance stretched into a tense 3 hours. The The mother stayed put, ignoring the rain that eventually began to sheet down, her gaze fixed immovably on the clinic door. When the doors finally opened and the news came, complete success, Alex was almost too exhausted to feel relief. 2 days later, he drove the recovering cub back to the cabin, placing the tiny patient, now bandaged and stable, back on the very step where this whole saga had begun. He waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes stretched into the late afternoon to appear. Had the separation been too long? Had the wild reclaimed her memory? Night fell, and Alex resigned, brought the cub inside. But as he sat watching the dark savannah, a final profound understanding settled over him. She hadn't abandoned the cub. She had completed her mission. Her trust was so total, so absolute, that she knew the life she had delivered to him was safe in his hands. The little lion thrived under Alex's tireless care, growing stronger day by day, wobbly at first, then bounding around the small cabin. 3 months blurred into 4, the juvenile lion's instincts returning, the tiny scar on his shoulder, a fading memory. It was time. Alex drove to the area where the mother was known to roam, opened the door, and the now powerful young cat leaped out without a backward glance, swallowed instantly by the tall grass and the freedom it craved. Alex watched him go, feeling the quiet closure of a duty fulfilled. It was 3 weeks later, patrolling a remote, rarely travelled sector, when his vehicle suddenly sputtered, coughed, and died completely. He was miles from assistance, isolated, and the unsettling silence that dropped over the savannah was a signal of danger. Then the grass moved, and a terrifying spectacle unfolded. A pack of at least 15 hulking hyenas materialized from the scrub, their characteristic cackling growing bolder as they lunged toward the powerless vehicle, snapping and tearing at the thin metal doors. Just as the primal fear threatened to overwhelm him, a roar, a sound more powerful, more terrifying than any thunder, shook the very ground beneath the truck. The hyenas froze as 2 blurs of tawny muscle exploded from the nearby acacia grove. It was the lioness, and beside her, nearly her size with a burgeoning mane, was the young lion he had saved. They moved with lightning coordination, scattering the terrified hyenas in seconds. The mother chased the last stragglers away while her son stood guard right in front of the Land Cruiser, his eyes fixed on Alex through the windshield. Alex stared, trembling, at the distinct, faint scar on the young lion's shoulder. It was undeniable. For 10 long minutes they stood their vigil, 2 magnificent guardians protecting the one who had once protected them. The mother turned, glancing toward the vehicle one final time, her eyes calm, certain. The silent message was clear: you saved his life, now we protect yours. As the sound of the rescue team's engine finally rumbled in the distance, the 2 lions turned as one and melted back into the vast, protective wilderness, leaving Alex with a profound realization that day he chose kindness over fear. He didn't just save a cub, he forged a debt repaid in salvation, an extraordinary truth written across the heart of the wild.